How would you connect this moment of revolution, or let's say equalizing, really, where we probably now have to kind of learn to be on eye level and to understand each other as one and be one species? How do you compare that with our relationship to the environment?
Yeah, I was just on a call the other day with a good friend of mine, and he was talking to me about how part of the work in both the environmental justice space, the climate space, and in a lot of social justice movements, prison reform movements, police reform, abolition, defunding the police, like a lot of these movements operate within the space of rejecting the idea of disposability. The resources, the planet is disposable, the communities are disposable, the people are disposable. And so many of these systems, of these harmful colonial constructs that are really the scaffolding for the existence of our societies, are built upon the disposability of people, of our land, of our oceans, of our culture. And that harm has perpetuated, things like the climate crisis. We don't see our earth as a sacred being, as a sacred part of our existence. We view it as something that we can take and extract from. We don't see these communities.
Exploit.
Exactly. And so I think this is a moment where we are being able to align our understandings of the vision we want to build moving forward, because it's not just about cleaning up plastic from the ocean. It's not just about removing CO2 from the atmosphere. It's not just about any one of these isolated things, because I think overall we are being faced with the moment where we have to transform these systems. We have to dismantle a lot of what doesn't work, but more importantly, build what we believe in, build the future that we can come together to imagine, that is more beautiful than the one we live in. And I think the struggles for environmental justice, environmental health are absolutely in alignment with the protection of our people, of our communities. So I think they're very connected issues, and now is the time for especially the environmental movement to really do the work to ensure that we communicate effectively around how we are connected, and we really give space for Black and Brown frontlines, Indigenous communities to lead the way, and for us to, for anybody else to kind of just hold space for that,
Yeah, and I think the old idea of like success or growth or survival even was to take away from others.
Yeah.
Take away from other humans or take away from nature. And I mean, there was never a stop to that. And actually, it was for a very long time, it was actually cool to be cruel. Like leaders were seen as strong if they would just not care and not kind of have any scruple. And I think at this point, we're hitting the wall with that totally. If we don't collaborate, if we're not on eye level, then there is no way anymore for our species to exist in the future. And that means on one side between us humans, but on the other hand, also between us and nature. If we don't learn to collaborate, we're pretty much done. And you grew up in a very different mindset, right? I mean, I saw interviews where I saw how, and I listened to what you said, and I heard how you have a very different idea of how humans are connected with the environment, with nature, the bond pretty much between these creatures. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of the idea of symbiosis between the natural world and humanity, in one way, I think that is showing up now more than ever, and we're being able to understand that, in a very profound way. And at the same time, like our cultures and our people, specifically Indigenous peoples, have existed and thrived and built societies and complex structures and uncovered sciences and developed different forms of artistry and cultural dynamics with these principles of symbiosis, with these principles of not just an extractive mentality, but a coexistence, and that's, I grew up with that being kind of the infrastructure for like the ground that I built my organizing efforts, my community organizing, the environmental work that I did was based on these teachings from my father, from my grandmother. On my father's side, they're all Mexica, indigenous peoples of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, of Mexico City. and I grew up with those teachings. And when we looked outside, everything from the rain that was falling in the city to the ants crawling, on the concrete in between the cracks in the sidewalk, like those are gifts and it's a part of who we are. And for indigenous peoples, our relationship with the land and with water and with the world around us isn't just a cause. It's part of our cultural survival. And so that was, I think, a little bit of a different framework that I grew up with. I know a lot of Native kids grew up with similar ideas. And that combined with my mother's, deeply rooted environmental work just gave me, I think, a unique understanding, of the world. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that. And a lot of kids don't have that opportunity to learn that at a young age. And I think that definitely shaped the way that I interact with the world.
You started very early, and I saw a talk when you were 12 at the UN. How was that moment when you're stepping in front of leaders of countries to share your views?
Yeah, it was very different, because I came up doing a lot of community organizing in Colorado, as a younger kid, working with the Earth Guardians and that organization that my mom began, and entering this highly bureaucratic space of the United Nations was different, than being with my community, than being with my family, than being in ceremony, than being out on the streets, being, in the community, growing our own food, like whatever it was that we were involved in. It was different than the vibes of being at the United Nations and stepping in front of this space where, I came and I had a message for world leaders, and I was 12 when I went to Brazil for the Rio Plus 20 UN Summit. And then I was 15 when I spoke at the Paris Climate Accords at COP21. Yeah, and so I was at these, like, present for these different moments. And what always stuck with me wasn't that this kid can come in and influence change at a global level because I was reaching all these world leaders. Like, to a certain degree, what was powerful about those moments wasn't the speeches that I gave. What the power in those moments was the way that people of all communities, of all spaces, were able to gather to demonstrate and to put pressure on world leaders in a way that one voice wasn't ever going to do. One voice, one speech was never going to create what a movement was able to do. And I saw that in Brazil, I saw that in Paris, and I saw people mobilizing to calling out the bureaucracy, calling out the slow moving pace of nations that are addicted to fossil fuels, that are addicted to having fossil fuel influence in our politics. And so it was a heavy thing. And I learned a lot from those experiences, for sure.
And you being given that stage encouraged a lot of other people as well. I mean, they feel like, okay, if he can do it, probably I can do it one day too, or I can do it in a different context. So being in these halls has a very strong influence on your network, on the movement of young environmentalists.
Absolutely. And I'm just grateful because when I was young, like, it was an anomaly for having a young, Native kid in these very white environmental spaces, institutions, whether it was the United Nations or even local organizing groups in my hometown. Like, there wasn't young brown kids involved in this kind of stuff in the same way that there is today. And now I look around me and I'm a part of a whole generation that's rising up. And that is what is powerful.
When you're sitting in these conferences or in workshops with leaders, are they talking to a kid, or are they talking to someone they can learn something from? Is it talking down, or is there an eye level? Is there like a true exchange of knowledge?
I say, when my memory of these spaces, and I haven't spent a lot of time at the UN in the last couple of years, feeling a little disillusioned, by that process, as I'm sure anybody who works closely in it has experienced. But when I got there, I feel like once people hear what I have to say, they realize, like, oh, there's some truth behind it, or there's, I think people write off young people as being, whatever preconceived notions they have is what our generation is going to show up as. But I think time and time again, as I continue to get older, as I continue to see more young faces at the space, like, we have become less of just like a symbolic gesture of the future, and more of like, oh, these young people are here to accomplish and create something now, today.
And probably to learn something from them, because I think the biggest difference is the perspective and the ability to look at things without these restrictions that you have. And pretty much had 20 years of career behind you, and you learned how many things won't work and how many doors will never open. I think it's a very big advantage if you don't have that experience, actually. If you just go and have your human sense and say, you know what, this doesn't work because we're doing something wrong and we can change it. I think this perspective can't be kind of seen in a different priority or value. It just should just meet. And it's important that these two perspectives from a next generation and today's generation, they just meet and they can just like more or less enable each others to learn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of value in intergenerational dialogue. And I learned that from a very young age, sitting and listening to our elders. And at the same time, our elders valuing the voices of the youth a lot, because they knew that we were not only the future, but we are actively building and bringing into reality, the visions and the prophecies and the stories that have been passed down and told.
What do you think is the biggest difference between current leaders and future leaders, if you want to call them, or young activists, when it comes to looking at the big environmental crisis we are facing today? What are the different views, and why is youth so much more engaged than old people?
I recently published a book titled Imaginary Borders, and it's like a tiny 60-page pocket book. And one of the main themes that the book discusses and explores is all of these imaginary barriers and borders and these concepts of separation that humanity has created to keep ourselves very far from the climate crisis, or very far from understanding how, any one of these environmental issues is actually intimately tied into every other social issue that we're experiencing. And the narratives that have existed even in the climate movement have had a very narrow point of view, I would say. And doesn't really build the bridges to how this affects my life. A kid out in the Midwest, a kid living in Canada, and it hasn't worked to build those bridges. And so I think what our generation has access to is we're growing up in a world where technology is allowed us to share and experience and understand how other people are existing. I think we are more interconnected. I think our identities inherently are more connected than any generation before us. So we look at the ruling generation, the people in power, the politicians that are making big decisions on our behalf. I think they are short-sighted in their understanding of environmental issues, because they are only looking, so far into the future. And so much of that vision is clouded by literally corporate influence, money and politics. And especially in the United States, we see that. And as these younger politicians are taking power, they're challenging those systems because they have this fresh perspective, this vision where they look at the climate crisis and they don't just see an issue of renewable energies and carbon, but they actually are looking at something that has to do with people's access to clean food, housing, access to clean water. It is connected to every product that we hold that is made out of plastic is a contribution to the petroleum industry. It looks at our access to, healthcare. How is that going to be impacted by a warming world? Our ability to respond to moments like this pandemic that we're in right now that are going to change as these superstorms, these wildfires, like those are just a part of the story. And the social infrastructure that we have created, that is being threatened by every environmental issue, that we are able to look at through this lens. And so I think that's that parallel or that those opposing perspectives, and we also just are literally going to be here for longer, so we will live with more of the impacts. That's just like the obvious one.
But I also see that people in power right now, they probably gave up at some point how far they can drive change. I think there are not so many people out there still that deny what is happening. And to be honest, when you talk to them in private, they admit these things and they also know where the solutions are. But I think of a lot of these leaders after these long careers and also these times where change was simply not possible, at least not for them, they don't even believe that they can change something themselves. I think they gave up. And I think there's like innocence and also naivety that you say, and that is in every artist, that is in every creator, to say, you know what, there is a standard, but I don't like it. Let's create a new one. That is something that is not so, not in so many minds. And that's something what you said in one of the interviews also, and that's what I totally share as an opinion, that everybody has to contribute if they're like more or less going and focusing on their strength and then their piece of knowledge they can contribute, and they trust in that. Where do you see the power of the individual?
Yeah, I think individual action. I was recently, talking with some friends and analyzing and looking at social movements. And one concept that we talk about is that the power in a social movement isn't just in the numbers and how many people we have out in the streets, because I think about so many times that I've been mobilizing with hundreds of thousands of people in New York, marching for the climate, or, at the end of the day, what changes? Everybody goes home, and it's actually about the ideas and the relationships and the connection between the people that go out and they mobilize. So the ideas that begin with one passionate person that can light a fire in the people that we have relationships with to collectively create something bigger than just our own idea. And I think the beauty of the individual is like, that is the beginning of transformation in a culture, right? And I think for us, as a younger generation specifically, we have seen how social movements move and shape culture. And the things that shape social movements are the stories that we tell. The stories that we tell begin with the imagination of an individual bringing that to a collective or to a community. So everything trickles back down to this one individual, not because one person alone is going to change the world, but one person alone can have some of the ideas that light that spark,
Power of an idea that actually in a perfect world doesn't belong to anyone, but belongs to everybody.
Absolutely.
You grew up in Boulder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very far from the sea. We are ocean people here at Parley.
Oh.
What's your relationship to the sea? When was the first time you jumped into the water?
My earliest memories were when I think I was maybe 2 or 3 years old, and I was in Mexico in Playa Azul. That's the first name that I remember that's associated with the memory. And I remember it's a beautiful, beautiful, like golden sand, beautiful deep blue ocean. There was like a little hut type kind of canopy where we're eating sopes. Sopes is like a really yummy traditional Mexican food with frijoles, with beans and cheese, and super fire. We were eating at a little sopes. I was just such a little kid. My mom was there, my pops was there, my godmother. And I remember looking out at the oceans, and a fisherman was walking in with a huge swordfish. And maybe it's just because I was little, but it looked really big, like at least as tall as this dude. And that was the first explicit memory that I had of the ocean, of being like, that was something magical to me. As you said, because I was born and came up far away from that. So from then on, every time I returned to it, it was like experiencing something magic. It was outside of my world a little bit.
The idea that the oceans and, of course, other big parts of our ecosystem are racing towards extinction right now, and probably next generation will not even see them anymore if you're not turning things around in light speed. What does this idea do to you?
I'd say one of the most impactful environmental documentaries I've ever seen in my life is a documentary called Racing Extinction.
Louis Saha's.
Yeah, that Louis is a G. I've met him a handful of times. He obviously also did The Cove, which talks about,
dolphin
trade of dolphin meat in Japan specifically. But that movie really tied the issues together of the global climate crisis and the erasure of species, the extinction of species. And again, it's not just a species. It's not just an animal. It's not just an animal in the ocean. And I think indigenous peoples, coastal indigenous people specifically, have deeply rooted relationships culturally, ceremonially, with these species, with these animals, with the ocean. In the same way that, I grew up with a certain connection to the land, there are communities who are also, their culture is being erased by the disappearance of these species in the ocean. And so when I think about species going extinct, it's transformed in my mind from just like a list of like endangered to, rare, to like this list that people think about, to like, yo, that's culture, that's human culture. That's the world, the earth's culture that is being wiped out. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. Like the thought of these species being gone before my children or that generation will be able to witness it is absolutely heartbreaking and heavy every time I think about it. And also from that weight comes a level of empowerment and responsibility that I feel to play my part.
And not so many people connect to that. right? I mean, not so many people have the feeling, oh my God, I'm going to lose something, or my families will lose something, because they probably don't even know nature. They don't relate to it. They have not seen life in that form, or connected and interacted with it. What do you think could make the environmental movement relevant to everybody, every single person that is out there that is human?
I think the communities that have experienced the worst of the impacts of the climate and environment, so of different environmental issues or different climate issues, whether it be, you know, air pollution or plastic pollution, or you know, storms and wildfires from the climate crisis. These communities understand this issue in a very different way, you know, and we are being exposed to the reality that part of making this something that everyone can connect to as best as we can comes, I believe, in a form of humanizing not just the crisis but the solutions, and telling stories of the communities, of the people that are interacting with this issue every day. And when I look at the frameworks that are being proposed right now to address this crisis, in the United States, you know, there's a lot of people that are pushing for something that's called a Green New Deal. And that is a framework that includes climate preservation and protection, but at its core is the reinvestment in our communities and people, and ensuring that people are a part of a transformation of our economies. And so I think those stories need to be bridged more clearly, that when we talk about environmental issues, we're not just talking about, you know, endangered species and the polar ice caps and the oceans, but it's like our economies, our culture, our entertainment, our stories that we are shaping and leaving, our food culture, that is all deeply connected to every environmental issue that our generation is experiencing. And building those bridges, I think, really comes from giving the voice back to the communities who have suffered the most. And because they've been the closest to the suffering and to the violence from these systems, they also have stories of the solutions. They have memories of what their communities look like before, you know, a lot of this violence was imposed on them, before, you know, massive overfishing from big industries in wealthy nations was stealing all the fish out of the ocean. You know, like if you go back and you speak to these communities, they have the vision, they have those relationships with the land, with their community. And so I think it's a big transition that the environmental movement has to realize, that like this hierarchical white leadership that has been at the top for so long, we need to dismantle that and redistribute power to frontline communities, to Black and brown and indigenous communities. I'm seeing that manifest in almost every climate organization that I've worked with, is a redistribution of power right now, because we are realizing that if we're continuing to do things as we have, we are not going to make progress at the speed that we need to. We need all voices at the table, especially those that are the closest to the issue.
Because they know, and they see the beauty, and they see the horror, and they see the cause of it.
Absolutely. And for them, it's not like an exterior, like, oh, I'm gonna go, you know, donate to some you know, a fund to help protect elephants in this part of the world.
It was a nice photo that kind of appealed to me.
It's gonna be, it's like they feel and they have experienced and have lived, you know, the marginalization and the impacts of not just the environmental issues, but the oppressive systems that enforce the environmental crisis, the oppressive systems that place pipelines underneath indigenous land.
Which is built on power and economy, end of the day.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And you can probably reduce it down to economy.
Yep, just a reimagination of how
because economy is based on a very exploitative idea and on keeping old structures as long as possible in place, so we can more or less exploit them as long as possible. Where the future in our eyes is a total new idea of economy, where it's all about collaboration, where it's all about actually new technologies, even like new ideas of how doing things actually doesn't have to harm, doesn't have to exploit, but goes in harmony with nature, which actually means that we have to learn from nature way more, which brings me again back to the indigenous people. There is an old knowledge, right, that has been passed over from generation to generation. And how can that be opened up? I mean, you spoke about storytelling, but you also touched towards science. How can we open up that knowledge from these tribes, from these communities, to a broader audience, so it becomes general knowledge?
Yeah, I think so much of it has to do with the ways that our stories are represented. And I think the world in general has a very poor understanding of indigenous communities, indigenous voices, indigenous struggles, especially with indigenous peoples in North America, in the continental US. There is so much so many harmful stereotypes. Our representation in mainstream cultures is terrible. And when we see it, it's through racist mascots and pro sports teams. It's through these caricatures of, you know, a very specific idea of a native person. And we're not all that, you know, and we have scientists, we have scholars, we have artists, we have visionaries, we have entertainers, we got comedians, we got people remembering ancient knowledge, and also people that are at the cutting edge of building what is new. So it's like indigenous cultures have not only the old answers and solutions, but like a lot of my friends talk about futurism through an indigenous lens too. And like, we will exist in the future. We will continue to, you know, persevere and be resilient to exist in the future. And part of that is in the ways we are reclaiming our own stories. And even TikTok, I'm sure you've heard of this app, right? Maybe are using this app to redefine the image of indigenous peoples in mainstream media by telling their own stories, by showing them like, yo, this is what indigenous people look like. We're not all just, you know, ceremonial, shamanic, like that's a part of who we are. But what colonization did is it robbed us and erased so much that like we have had to do the work to piece our cultures back together every generation. And so we're bringing the issues to light. We're using these mainstream tools like TikTok to talk about missing and murdered indigenous women and why that's connected to fossil fuel extraction in Canada and the United States. And so these new platforms, these new technology, this is giving us opportunities to reclaim our narratives. And that's part of what I do with my music too. And what I see a lot of other indigenous artists, not just musicians, do with their art, because they get to project their own voice into the world. And
trust your own voice and take a stage for it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. I mean, it's all about the medium, more or less, that reach people. And if you're not sending, if you're not broadcasting, then you leave it to people that are defining these views. So everybody has a voice, and everybody can actually take a stand to it, right? Mm-hmm. What's for you the best tool to tell a story? We spoke about a platform, but you also mentioned music. What's the best way of like speaking about these things and carrying it out in the world?
I think for everyone, it's through doing what you love. And for me, that has manifested through my music. And I've been doing this at the UN since I was 12, speaking publicly since I was 6, and have this like long history of organizing and such. And in a lot of ways, my relationship with organizing with different organizations, with the movement as a whole, wasn't healthy. And when I began to write music about it, when I began to create art around it, like that's when I was able to reclaim my own story in a lot of ways. And a lot of publications, you know, to this day, they want to portray my image in a certain way. You know, they want to portray me in a certain light that fits the box that they've created for young indigenous activists suing the government, or, you know, at the United Nations, like whatever it is. And so my art has given me an opportunity.
How does that show? What do they want to see from you?
I think they want to see like and I think a lot of it's a lot of these publications demonstrated by like literally images, like old pictures of me from when I was a young kid, from when all I was doing and all I was talking about was the environment and the organization I work with, Earth Guardians, and they want to like create heroes out of individuals rather than share the overall like message and story that is deeper than just me as a figure or as a leader. It's like, what am I representing? And that's what I love about having grown up through my music and also through these new conversations, is like I get to represent myself, and I got to be like, no, like I'm not gonna let y'all, you know, publish that in that way, because, you know, this is who I am. This is what I stand for. And this isn't about me. None of this is about me or my platform. It's about what we believe in and what we're fighting for in the greater movement. And so that's been a
fall into the vanity trap, right?
Yeah. And that's, you know, I've been really blessed to have elders and people around me my entire life that have just reinforced the message of humility, stay humble. And not to say that I've ever always done that right, or I'm doing that right, but like
hard.
it's a part of what I strive to reinforce, as much as possible.
Yeah. What do you think can the world that is not living with nature, that's not growing up with these mindsets, can learn from indigenous people?
This is very broad, but I think the world could learn to challenge our values. Because when we think about a lot of the values that we have in our culture, we don't really think where that comes from or what is behind it, or this idea of accumulation of wealth, of ownership of land, of ownership of property, of ownership of material wealth. Like, we don't question where that comes from. And I think a lot of the values represent a different relationship with one another, with our land, with the women in our communities. I think is a really powerful example in indigenous communities. And so I think what the world can learn is to look within, to reevaluate how we put value on different things. And there's a lot to be learned, and there's a lot to be changed in how we see the world. And, indigenous communities, because of the violence we've been subjugated to, like, we're stumbling through a lot of it, and we have a lot to unlearn as indigenous people. And there's a lot of trauma, and there's a lot of,
anger also, I guess.
Yeah, all of that. There's a lot of negativity in our communities that we're working to overcome to this day. But I think, it's like a reassessment of our values based on, I think, just respect for all life. I think that's like something that stems into our relationships with other people that don't look like us, that our relationships with, even members of different communities from, LGBTQIA communities. Like, traditionally, ancestrally, we had people that didn't subscribe to a gender binary, or that didn't subscribe to heteronormative like standards that we have now in this westernized world. So, like, a lot of that is challenged by indigenous cultures, and, like, there's a lot to be learned by just understanding and, like, being humble. I don't know. So it's a good question, and that's a little bit of my thoughts.
With COVID-19, everything was happening, but also activists being heard, really. And you're seeing now consequences of their resistance and their rebellion. How will the movement change over the next years to come?
We are absolutely in a moment of transformation within the movement, within these organizations, within these institutions. We are being pushed to challenge the ways in which our organizations actually perpetuate a lot of harmful systems, and I think the powerful movement for racial justice and for the defense of Black life has stirred, like the legacy or the history of specifically environmental organizations. Like, a lot of that is rooted in white supremacy and in a lot of, marginalization and erasure of indigenous culture, of Black and brown culture, exclusion of those voices. And, I think there's been progress made in the last 5-10 years, certainly, but there's a lot of it that we haven't really confronted also. And so I think we're being confronted, with a lot of how unintentionally oftentimes, but, like, our organizations and these institutions are perpetuating harm. And we are being called to really look at, like, what are we bringing to this moment? Because, first of all, the earth doesn't have a lot of time. Humanity doesn't have a lot of time to correct course. And at the same time, if we build Band-Aid type temporary solutions while perpetuating some of these same,
just lying to ourselves.
Exactly. We're not gonna have the solutions that we think we will, because it will still, at the root of these solutions, be white supremacy, erasure of marginalized voices, patriarchy. A lot of this will be at the core if we don't shift the ways in which we've been doing things. And so I'm seeing that with various organizations that I've worked with. And I think it's a powerful moment of awakening and of transformation. Like, the time is up for white institutions to be leading this fight. Absolutely. That doesn't mean that, white people can't be in leadership positions, or white people can't be, doing good work, but it's about like, how do we return to a place of balance so that the vision that we project into the world of what we want to create together is wholesome and is representative of everyone.
At Parley, we believe in collaboration, and we believe on meeting on eye level. Otherwise, there's no way to turn things around in time. Because if we believe the scientists, if we believe our own, honestly, our own eyes, when we're out there looking at the problems, then it is probably already too late. But if you're not turning things around like in rapid speed, we're talking the next 10, 15 years. I think we all agree on the next 10 years. We're done. At least we will not live on this planet in the way that our ancestors did.
Not at all.
And the question is, no, 10 years is nothing. 10 years goes by exactly like this.
I've done it twice and it went by real fast.
Yeah. So the question is, how do we use these 10 years? What can be achieved? Really, I mean, if everything goes perfectly well, and first of all, what's the plan? But if we would have a plan and we would say, let's go forward, let's just do it. Let's just like convert everything. What can we achieve in 10 years? You know, how can we be fast enough not to miss the deadline here? That's the big riddle, I feel.
Yeah. We have the technology that we need.
Do we?
I think we do. I think, and obviously it can keep getting better and we can continue to invest in the exploration of how to do that. But I think, yeah, it's like a lot of it is the political will, you know. I think transforming our politics and our economics, you know, to be systems that are designed to protect human well-being. And what we're seeing in the United States is a lot of these systems that are constructed don't exist to actually serve the people. Whether it's our medical system that is failing us in the US right now, especially with this pandemic, or our housing system, being the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and we can't house our people, but we have more people in prison and incarcerated than in any other nation in the world. Those systems don't exist to serve or protect people, to protect life. And so inherently our approach to an existential threat is going to be something that fails to preserve and protect life. Because if you look at this game that we're going to be entering over the next 10 years, from solely a place of carbon emissions, and there's a lot of ways you can do that. Carbon neutrality in itself is a concept that leaves a lot of space for us to not actually keep fossil fuels in the ground, to not fully hold, corporations and governments accountable. And so I think a lot of it has to do with, I think, these uprisings of people taking to the streets and demanding, not just saying F the police, but saying let's defund the police and let's invest in our communities. That's, I think, a trend from, that's a difference in a lot of the conversations that I'm seeing right now. Is people are really on this wave of like, what are we building? And how do we build this infrastructure and get these corporations and get these governments that have profited for so long off of the exploitation of our people? How do we get them to transform, to invest in our communities? How do we build leverage politically to put people in power that represent our voices and that don't represent the expansion of capitalism and the corporate capture of our communities? So I think the vision and the roadmap for the next 10 years, I don't know, but I think a part of it, ingredients of it, will be people taking to the streets in the way that we're seeing all over the world in part. And in addition to that, coming together and architecting, envisioning, and imagining what is possible, and having a dialogue that exists, that is a collaborative between community members and individuals that will be at the forefront of this new infrastructure that we are building, and scientists and economists and political analysts, people that from many different sectors that can come together to really see that at the end of the day, how do we invest in human systems? How do we make sure that people, have access to food, have access to the basics? Because, that doing that would mean challenging a lot of what this capitalistic model has created for us. And And I think at the heart of the climate crisis of many environmental issues is the sickness of capitalism. And so challenging that and saying, how can we create prosperity for our people in a way that isn't exploitive and extractive? Because prosperity doesn't look like destroying the planet to build houses. You know, that's not what prosperity looks like. That's not longevity, you know?
So what you're talking about is on one side, changing the system, like the whole system pretty much on which our society is based on. And on the other side, we're talking technical solutions, we're talking material solutions for problems we created. And I think these are two very big challenges, right? And they go hand in hand, and they depend each other and they interlink. But still, when you're looking at 10 years and when you're looking at how slow societies change, it's a very intense schedule. What's your message for people that would ask you, especially youth, what can I do? How can I find out what my mission is? What's the first step I can take?
There's a lot out there. There's a lot going on. There's a lot wrong with the world. There's a lot wrong with humanity. There's a lot of issues. And while all that is real, I have already seen and believe that our generation won't allow those things to define who we are. And that's not because, you know, each one of you is like going to change the whole world or that needs to do all that work. But I believe that we all have a part to play in this journey, and however small that is. And I think when we think about our purpose, and that's like an existential thing that I think every young person is asking themselves to an extent, you know, I think we can think about the things that we love in this world. That is what we are here to defend. This is not about F the system and just, you know, dismantling. Like, that's a part of it, right? That's a part of it, you know, addressing and confronting these extractive and dangerous systems. But part of it is like, how do we build a world that protects what we love, whether that be our culture, our food, our family, our connection to our own abilities to create art or to create music, like, and really, like, I would say really inform yourself too. It's really good to be informed and to and a part of being informed is surrounding yourself with people that can help you on the journey of learning, because it's really easy to get overwhelmed by media, by the books that detail what the future could look like. Like even just our social media feeds, like there's so much. You can follow 1,000 accounts that give you information. And at the end of the day, like if you're not checking in with yourself and making sure that you're good, that you're having a healthy relationship with the intake of information, and you don't have other people around you that are your community that help check in on you like that, like you're going to get overwhelmed because it's overwhelming. We live in an overwhelming world. So I really pragmatically, obviously there's like everybody has a part to play. Everybody has their own expertise, their own talent, their own, whether it be entrepreneurship or storytelling and music or, you know, community organizing or healing, like whatever it is, like you have something to bring to the space. But pragmatically, it's like inform yourself and build your community. That's what I would say. And those are the two of the things that allow me to have a place in the world in this way, is by having a community around me that uplifted and supported me. And also that held me accountable and called me on my bullshit, because I've been on that, you know? And so it's a balance. Inform yourself, keep your eyes open, and also ground yourself in the reality that this work does not have to be solely resistance work, that this can be building what we know is possible, starting with small things, starting with how we treat ourselves, with how we treat our parents, with how we treat our family, and how we treat our neighbors. Literally, like those are the small revolutions that lead to us changing our relationship with what is out there. And that's what a lot of our community teaches and talks about, that like what happens internally is not separate from the world. We are not separate from the world. So the work has to start at that level, I believe.
You said that the crisis now, everything that happened in the last 4 or 5 months, put you in a place when you were like looking out, so like recalibrating your own role in the movement. Do you know what you want to focus on?
I'm really excited about how my art can be a contribution to this moment, and also like a part of my own liberation, you know, individually, in my own healing, actually. And I think that when we do work to heal ourselves in a greater context, not just for the sake of, you know, there's a lot of like wellness stuff out there that I don't really believe in or agree with, or that's very capitalistic. But like when we heal ourselves and we heal our relationship with ourselves and those around us, that can be a beautiful place to do better work in the world. And so I think my music, I think I've seen how it speaks to people, and I've seen how that's been a voice for myself, and that tells a story that is also much greater than me, much greater than just my experiences, even though that's primarily what it is reflective of. And so I'm really excited to put energy into cultivating that, into being an artist, into being not just an artist with a message, but like a damn good artist, you know, who makes records that people can look at and like, that was beautiful art and it told a story, not just like, oh, that was a cool message, you know? And so I'm inspired by that. And at the same time, honestly, architecting infrastructure within the Earth Guardians organization to invest in Indigenous youth through these education programs, through investing in land that we can start training, you know, facilities to help bring youth to dive into food sovereignty, to dive into, you know, different skills that we can learn, organizing skills, bring it back to the land, and then, you know, help these youth build their ideas and bring them to fruition, into reality. So those are two things. So it's just like supporting and creating spaces to bring people's visions to life, and then also doing that myself through my music.
Great. So yeah, exciting, man.
Thank you, bro. I'm excited.
No, hey, thanks for taking the time. It was a great conversation, and I love what you do, and I'm gonna keep observing, and hopefully we keep interacting as well.
Absolutely. And again, keep up the great work. Look forward to seeing what Parley does, you know, in the next 10 years as well. We have these are gonna be crazy years, man. These are gonna be really crazy years for all of us. So I wish you the best, and stay humble, stay inspired. We'll connect soon.
Cheers, man.